Bob, thanks for being here tonight.
My pleasure.
Tell me how you came to take this role.
They offered me a lot of money. Excuse me, I have a cold, I'm sorry. I was drawn to it because I'd been acting and directing and producing, and I wanted to just go back to acting, back to my roots. And so this was a chance to be an actor for hire. But also, it was about a story that I thought was really worth telling because it had so much attached to it. It had to do with the lives we're living now with journalism and the landscape and how it's changing and how it's affecting people and so forth. So to me, it was also a really good script. But it was a script that was taken from a book by Mary Mapes, which you know. And I was just a character in it. And for me, I felt that the heavy lifting, really, talking about acting, Cate Blanchett is just terrific.
Well, Bob, I'm interested, and I think our audience may be interested. How does this work? Someone brings you a script and says, would you be interested in doing this? Or they call you and say, we'd like to send you a script. How does it work?
Well, yeah, it used to be that way. Now, they don't send scripts so much anymore, but I mean, it used to be that you would be sent scripts. You had an agent, and the agent would be the in-between person, and they would send you scripts, and then usually an agent would advance the script and say, we think you ought to read this. And then, I'll tell you something happened. I was here doing a photo shoot, and this guy looked like a panhandler, and he was driving a truck. And he came up to me and he says, hey, I got a disc here. Would you just play this? And this was Ed Burns, who did Brothers McMullen. And so I thought, well, my initial impulse was to say, hey, I can't. And then I thought, well, wait a minute, why not? So I took it, and then I looked at it, and I said, hey, this is really good. So we got it into our festival at Sundance, and then his career went off. So I felt you always should pay attention. If somebody comes to you and they have a disc or something like that, you can only do so much, but you should always listen to that person.
Well, you bet. Well, I know you'll agree that this is an extraordinary cast in this film, even beyond you and the great Cate Blanchett and yourself. This is an outstanding cast. Does that make a difference when you look at the script and you say to yourself, yeah, I think this might be something worth doing? Does it make, it's bound to make some difference. Does it make a big difference or not so much difference when they say Cate Blanchett's going to play the lead and these are other supporting characters we have?
Well, I think at first, for me, it begins with the script itself and who's going to be doing it, who's going to be, not so much the producing end of it, but who's going to be the director. But basically, for me, it's all about story. What's the story? And I usually try to break it down into 3 parts. What's the story? Because I think story is essential. And who are the characters that embody the story? And then where's the emotion? It's got to have all those 3 things. And so when this script came to me, it wasn't so much about who else was in it, because I didn't know who was in it. I just read the script and I said, this is smart, it's tough, but it's got all those 3 things. It's a great story, a story that I think needs to be told because it never was really told, and that involves you. And so I thought, that story that this man went through and what he went through is a story that was not really fully told at the time, and maybe now there's enough distance that story can be told in detail and have some traumatic value. So basically, it's script, story, and then the cast came together, I think, simply because everybody saw a good script.
Well, Bob, in shooting the film, again, I'm always interested in how things work from the inside. Do you take yourself off and sort of go into your own world and concentrate on it? Or do you work in spurts and say, look, I'm going to work for 2 hours today, memorizing my lines, developing the lines, what have you? How do you do it?
Well, that's a secret, Dan. I think first of all, it is a private thing. I think that being an actor, you carry something around inside yourself that's sort of private, and some of that you keep to yourself. At least that's the way I feel about it. You don't let everything out. You let out what needs to be to service the story and the character, but something you keep back for yourself, because that's basically your full contribution, is to keep something back for yourself. So there's that. Then the story itself, and how does the character fit into the story. In this case, I think all these actors, I didn't know who was going to be in it. It was like, this is a wonderful story, and it's a great character to play. And that's what, as an actor for hire, I just love the idea. I'm just going to be an actor in this, and be able to focus only on being an actor. And then the question was, what am I going to do with you? You know, as how do you play a guy that everybody knows? And what I was saying earlier, if this story had happened a year or two ago, I wouldn't have gone near it, because it would have been too fresh. But the fact that there was some distance, that it was 2004, that there was some distance between when this happened and now, and you could see how maybe the landscape has changed in terms of journalism, in terms of truth. And for me, the overriding headline for this would have been when politics interrupts the truth. And so to me, that was the top thing. So then you go down into, okay, that's the story. Politics gets in the way of the truth. Then who are the characters that are affected, and what's the emotional core? And of course, that's the relationship between you and Mary and Cate and myself. So for me, it was focusing on that relationship. And when I called you, I called Dan when I was going to do this, and I said, look, I have a script here where I would be playing you. Is there anything you want to tell me? And so he could have said, don't do it. You know, he could have said, don't. But he jumped into right to the core. He said, look, Bob, it was about loyalty. And that hit me hard. He said, it's about loyalty. I was loyal to three parts. I was loyal to my partner, Mary Mapes. I was loyal to my boss, CBS. And that was like a triangle of loyalty. And that's what I was committed to. And to me, the story was how one part of that fell out. And I was really interested in how that happened. What was that story?
Was it or was it not a case that someone who helps you decide, you of course make your own decisions, but did an agent or somebody close to you say something along the lines, Bob, this is going to be a controversial film. You can't do this film and not expect to have a lot of blowback and the film be denigrated by a number of people. Was that a factor in your decision at all?
No, they didn't say anything about that. They thought it was a good script and it was a good role, so that was the end of that. But I felt there would be controversy for obvious reasons, and sure enough, and here it is. And I suspect there's going to be a lot of it. You expect the other side is not going to. They're not going to send flowers, you know. Sorry. So they're going to come out against it and with all guns firing. You expect that. And the only outcome I would hope for would be that if enough people see the film, it'll start a conversation. That's all I would hope for, is that people start talking about journalism, the truth, and how the landscape has changed and how it affects them on a personal basis.
You've done it. You bet. Thank you. You've done at least 3 films in which you play.
More than that.
Oh, no. 3 You've done a hell of a lot more than that. But you've done 3 films in which you played the role of a journalist. You did All the President's Men, a great film. Did a film in, when was it, 1996, called Up Close and Personal with Michelle Pfeiffer. and then you've done this film. So you've done at least those three. I mean, what is there about journalism, or is there anything about journalism that attracts you to these roles?
Well, the value of journalism, for one thing, and what's the story behind that? You know, what is it about journalism? What does it take to get journalism, to get the story out there? And that, of course, goes to the journalist. So what's that like? What's it like to be the journalist, particularly when you're against the odds? I mean, the difference between this, what you and Mary were up against, you didn't have the support of your bosses that Woodward and Bernstein had with Ben Bradley and Kay Graham. The fact is, you had the same odds going against you. You had an administration that was out to get you. It was out to get them, I'm sorry, it was out to get them. The administration, really, politics was really trying to crush journalism. But because they had a team and they fought it and they stayed with it, they broke through and achieved what they achieved. I don't think you had that support.
No. And when you did Up Close and Personal, you played a news director in Miami. Why did you take on that role?
Michelle Pfeiffer.
And that's reason enough. That's reason enough.
Well, I liked, first of all, the people that wrote it, Dominic Dunn and Joan Didion, and I was fans of theirs. I loved her work from the very, very beginning. So that was part of it.
Well, Bob, I'm interested in how you got into acting. I mean, you were a star athlete in high school.
I'm not a star.
Well, good enough to go on and play in college, be good enough to play in college. Left-handed hitting first baseman he was. But how did you get into acting? Was it that early at the college stage, or did it come later?
Oh, no, it came later. I grew up in a kind of a working class environment in Los Angeles, and I hung out with some, pretty rough bunch. And we would go to the matinee on weekend, and we would make fun of the screen. And that we thought that was pretty hot. Let's go make fun of the screen. So there would be a love scene, for example. We go, oh yeah, you tell him, lover, that kind of stuff. So the idea of me being that guy, I just couldn't face that. So the idea that I would be one of those, I just couldn't imagine it. So when I went to New York, I came as an artist, and then a series of serendipitous turns turned me into the American Academy of Dramatic Arts, and I wasn't planning on it, but I was trying to keep people off my back. People want to know what I was going to be, family and friends, what's going to happen with you? And I didn't want to answer that question because I didn't know. And I was going to Pratt Institute in Brooklyn to study art, and I told people that it's a great school. I told people that I wanted to. They said, "Well, what are you going to do?" And I would make it up. I said, "I'm going to be an art designer. I'm going to be a production designer." I had no idea what that meant, but it sounded strong. It sounded really like a upholding thing, and so I just didn't know. So I went into the school, and I had to break through that feeling of being an actor. It really took me a while. I was very angry. And I think I sent that signal out that I was angry, and I had to break through that. So it took a little while, and then I kept thinking, well, I have to go back to Pratt. But then something clicked that I just wasn't anticipating, and that was when I started to act, there was just a couple of moments that suddenly there was a click, and I thought, I'm enjoying this. I don't know why I'm enjoying it, but I'm enjoying it. Something feels good about what I'm doing that I never dreamed would feel good. And from that point on, I had to accept the fact that art was probably going to have to be a hobby, that I had to pursue this new direction that I'd never anticipated.
Well, in addition to an outstanding, to say the least, acting career, you've also been an active citizen. For example, your work in trying to protect the environment. How did that develop, or have you, how did that come about?
Well, it came about, I'm going to pull you into this. it came about when I was a kid in Los Angeles, and I was working to earn money, and I worked at a Standard Oil refinery. And I had to clean out tanks and things like that, and I saw how dirty it was, and I could see what was coming out of the ground and what was in the sand and so forth, and it really hit me. And then the city that I loved as a child suddenly disappeared right under my feet. A city that had green spaces between communities. The ocean was near to me, so that was my recreation. I could go into the water, it was free, and I could learn to surf, and it was free, and it felt great. So the environment was a big part of things. Then I went to Yosemite National Park, and I worked there for a couple of summers, and that hit me hard. I said, there's something about this that's really wonderful. Then LA had no land use plan, and so what happened was, it was like a gold rush. When the war ended, suddenly people flooded into LA, and before I knew it, there were freeways, and there were skyscrapers, and I felt that the city that I loved as a kid just sort of, is like being too long at the fair. It just disappeared. So I went further away into the environment, and the more time I spent in the environment, the more I realized that it was under threat, and how much it meant to me on a personal basis. I said, well, this is really, if we don't, this is just one planet that we know about. You know, if we keep doing this, there's not going to be much left. So I began to get committed to, we develop for our survival, but we should be preserving for our survival. So I got committed to the preservation part of it. And then I encountered how unpopular that was, and that all the energy was going towards energy development. So I guess it started there, and it just kept going, and I felt that if I had some voice to give to this, that I was an actor, that was my main line, but the other part of me, the civic part, if I could, whatever small voice I had to put to the cause of, let's give nature credit, let's let nature breathe, that's what I would do. So getting to Dan, there was a situation in Utah, because I then bought some land in the mountains in Utah. And what was happening with back in 1973, 74, word got out that the energy companies in 4 states were planning a series of coal-fired power plants in the West, and nobody knew about it because they were keeping it under wraps. They didn't want that to get known. So there's Utah Power and Light, Southern California Edison, Arizona Public Service, and they were planning, and I got wind of this, and so I thought, God, this would be a disaster, because there'd be coal-fired power plants all through the national park system and so forth, and nobody knows about it. So I did whatever I could to get the word out, but I got no traction. And so in desperation, I thought, well, why don't you get a hold of 60 Minutes? And those guys dig into stuff. They like to dig underneath things and pull the story out. So I called Don Hewitt at 60 Minutes, and I told him what the deal was. And I said, would you guys be interested in coming out here and uncovering something that if it doesn't get exposed, I don't know what's going to happen here. So they sent Dan Rather out. So Dan came out, so Dan and I connected in 1974, and I said, Dan, you got to get down there with me. You got to get down on it. We're going to go down into Lake Powell. We're going to go down into the reservation areas and where there are petroglyphs and pictographs, and we're going to see it. And he did. And so that's how Dan and I met, and then that show, I guess you can go to you, Dan, the show was successful. And I got burnt in effigy after that, because I was a villain in the state of Utah.
Well, getting back to the film a bit, and no, because I think when you see a film, even though you think you know the principal actors in the film, it's always good to think about how they got to where they are. And with this particular film, you said once, in fact said very recently, when you did All the President's Men, that you were, in a way, a little disappointed in what the public took away from the film. You had hoped that it would be, inspire certain things, and it didn't happen. I'm interested to know, what you hope will be the takeaway from this film.
Sure. You don't want to talk about Kaparowitz? Sure. Oh, okay, no, I'm kidding. What I was afraid, what I didn't anticipate was I was so excited to be able to have made that film. And so when suddenly there were a lot of kids going into journalism, I was very excited. But then I got nervous about were they going into it for the right reasons? Because the film had to do with two young reporters who were at the lower part of the ladder. Through their hard work that few others were doing, brought down the strongest man in the land. And I thought, well, I hope the young generation of people that want to get into journalism and go to these schools go into it for the right reason and don't go in there. And I started to get nervous that maybe they were going in because they wanted to take someone down, and that they were excited by the idea of getting into journalism so they could find someone to take down. That was just something that hit me, and I worried about it.
And with this film, with truth, what do you hope will be the takeaway?
Well, as I said earlier, I hope that it will be, I think it will be controversial. It already is. And I think that's good, that's healthy. I think controversy gets people thinking and talking, and I hope this film does that, because I think it's worth, journalism is essential. And the landscape has changed so drastically since I got involved that, you know, you take a look at it and say, well, how can we keep alive the value of journalism, getting the truth to people when it gets so hard, when you have politics getting in the way, you have corporation takeovers getting in the way, you got all these elements that weren't there a long time ago in the mix, which makes it very hard for a human being to look and find out where is the news, where is the truth. So I'm always hopeful, and I will always be committed to that hope.
Well, Bob, we have questions from the audience. It's about time for us to go to the questions. Because they had some microphone difficulties, I think we have the questions. These are questions from the audience. For some of you, the first one is, Mr. Redford, what can, in your opinion, what can the American public do to ensure that truth in media is upheld?
What can the public do?
Yes.
Well, pay attention.
Well, I think also what the public can do, if I may add on to it, because Bob and I have been discussing this earlier in the evening, is to bring a certain skepticism, never cynicism. Cynicism is toxic, but to bring a certain skepticism to say, okay, this is what those in power want us to believe, whether they're Democrat, Republican, conservative, or liberal, or what have you. This is what they are trying to get us to believe. Now let me bring some skepticism to that. Ask some questions, dig into a little bit, and make up your own mind. A question says to Dan Rather, did you know Walter Cronkite personally? Yes, I did. That I worked for and under and with Walter Cronkite for more than 20 years. And that continued to know him, of course, after he at his own decision, left as anchor and managing editor of the CBS Evening News, and I succeeded him. I hope you note that I said succeeded him, not replaced him, because no one replaces an icon, a legend like Walter Cronkite. But we stayed in touch some through at least the early and mid 1980s. But I did know him very, very well, and to say the least, he was one hell of a journalist. Bob, it says here, this from a man named Tom Waters, Bob Redford, you recently asked to read Todd Wasserman's The Last Battle. And the question says, like this film is based on true events, are you particularly drawn to these type of scripts?
No, how is it being classified? What type of script is it? A war story, or how do you mean?
I'm pausing because I don't know. I'm looking back over the questions. And I think what he means, things based on a true story.
Well, yeah. I mean, I'm all for that. I mean, things based on a true story, but the big question is, what's the truth? You know, I think that's the big question. And usually facts should support that, you know, unless you mess around with the facts. But yeah, no, I'm all for that. I thought you were talking about a war story.
No, I believe what the question refers to is stories that are based on true stories and that try to be true to the true story as opposed to fiction. And I think that's what he was referring to.
Well, I think that gets into journalism. I mean, that gets into I think it's vital. I think it's vital for everybody, whatever age you're at, to be able to feel that you can rely on some source to tell you the truth about what's going on. But I think it's getting harder and harder.
Now, Mr. Redford, question from the audience. You and Paul Newman are my dream list to work with. With Mr. Newman no longer with us as a questioner, could you tell us what it was like to work with him? What was his process, and what did you learn from working with Paul Newman?
He's a very honest man and a very generous man. Those are the two things that hit me, because when we worked together on the film we did, the Butch Cassidy, the studio, the studio did not want me because I was not well known like he was. He was a pretty well known guy, and I just done a couple of films, and so therefore it sat with the director George Roy Hill, the writer William Goldman, and Paul eventually, who I did not know and not met. And it sat with them to approve me to be able to be in the film, to go against the studio who tried to keep me out because they felt it was too imbalanced. He was well known and I wasn't. So Goldman was in, George Roy Hill was in. Then initially they had approached me about playing Butch Cassidy because I'd done a comedy on Broadway. And I told George Roy Hill, we went to a bar on 3rd Avenue and we were having a drink and talking. I said, look, I'll do that, but that's not the character that interests me. The character I identify with is the other guy, Sundance Kid. And I said, he was fascinated by that, and I said, I think my whole life I've had a slight outlaw sensibility, and that's who I feel more connected to that character. So he got really intrigued with that and decided based on the meeting we had that maybe that's the way he would like to go. Now, the original title of the script was The Sundance Kid and Butch Cassidy. And that was the original title. And so, and make a long story short, I ended up meeting Paul. And he said, let's go with this guy. Let's go with this guy. Had it not been for Paul, I wouldn't have been in the film. It just wouldn't have happened. It was very generous for a guy to take that kind of a chance. And then once he was in, they changed the title. Once he's going to play Butch Cassidy, it's Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. But George Roy Hill knew something about Paul that I think the audience saw him in a different way. He knew that Paul was a very excitable, energetic guy, and he saw him as Butch Cassidy. So that changed the whole story, and Paul and I became really good friends. Now, I'll tell you one quick, I don't know how much time we got, but about our relationship, but we had a lot of fun kidding each other, playing tricks on each other and so forth. It was just fun. And we played trick after trick after trick. I'd loosen his saddle, because he hated horses. He hated rides. So I loosened his saddle. And so finally, what happened, when I was younger, I raced cars for a short period of time. So I was really into racing. And I managed to get a hold of a 904. It was just made one year, and I had this car. There was only 100 of them that were made. So we were making Butch Cassidy, and I said, you want to ride, let's go back and forth to my place up in Utah, and we'll ride in this car. So he fell in love with the car. And next thing you know, he went off to Bondurant's driving school and became an ace, just a complete ace. He went to his driving school, got into racing, and then you know what happened there. He turned out to be a phenomenal, skilled racer. That was great, but the problem was, whenever I'd get together with him, that's all he'd talk about. He said, like, racing, racing, racing. If I say, Paul, I got it, you know, I did that. You're not the first guy to come on the planet here with this. You know, he just couldn't stop talking about it. So anyway, because we lived together, we had a place near each other in Westport, Connecticut, and so I decided to play a joke on him, and I said, went to junkyard, and I said, "Do you guys have any kind of a smashed car, preferably a Porsche? Can you get?" And they said, "Well, we don't know. We'll let you know." And finally, they called and they said, "Hey, we have a crutch Porsche. A big bus fell on it from a bridge." And so I said, "Well, hold on, let me get down there." And so I went down there. I said, "Can you guys wrap?" It was just a piece of crap. I mean, it was just. I said, "Can you guys wrap this in paper and put a ribbon around it and put it on Paul Newman's back porch?" So they said, "Yeah, that's pretty great, you know." So anyway, so then I let it go. So I come back a couple of weeks later, and I called the guys. I said, "Did you deliver that?" And they said, "Yeah, we did." I said, "Oh, that's it." Next week I came up, and and I was renting this house. Inside the foyer was this big, huge box. And it took me about an hour and a half to crowbar the thing open, and there was a big block of metal, a big square block of metal. I said, "Oh, I get it. I see what he did." So he took this and he had it melted down into another shape. So I then called a friend of mine who was a sculptor, and I said, "Look, I've got something for you. If you can, and not a very good sculptor." So I said, "Do you think you could do this into a garden piece? You know, they could be put in the garden." She said, "Oh, great, that's great. I need that material." In the meantime, neither one of us had ever mentioned any of this to each other. So he never mentioned the car in the back of his porch. I didn't mention this. She then got the thing, went over, and I told these same guys that were moving everything back and forth. I said, "Hey, guys, I got something for you." And they said, "Hey, this is really a great thing for us." You know, I said, "Take this sculpture and put it in Newman's garden and just leave it there." So they did, and I called them. I said, "Did you do that?" And they said, "Yeah." I said, "Okay." And to this day, we never spoke about it.
Ladies and gentlemen, our time is up. Mr. Robert Redford.